A warm welcome here in Keulenaar at the IMPAKT panel War on Facts. We're going to have an intimate setting, so all of you who actually would like to join in a discussion, please come forward. There's a few seats on the front row that you might actually be taking up. It's also easier for me because I'll be walking over with a microphone in my hand if you have a question. Nobody? Well, that's all right. Luckily, we have 3 people here that have been invited by the curators of the exposition Truth That Lies, for which you're all very welcome to join us for the official opening at 1700, which means a little bit less than 2 hours from now. So we're going to try to speed things up here so that we're all going to be on time op Lange Nieuwstraat by having left this place. The exposition and this panel are complementary. Some of you might have read and some of you might know by heart already that actually these are 2 departments from the same ministry that George Orwell described in his novel 1984. So we have the Department of Records, the things that are actually laid out, and we have the Department of Fiction, actually the Truth That Lies. Where you are now is actually the Department of Records. We're going to try to analyze fake news. We're going to try to analyze what is happening on websites, on social media, and especially the side of the alt-right. And we're going to try to learn a few lessons for, I might say, progressives. We're all amongst ourselves. Is there anybody here who considers him or herself to be alt-right? It would be very lovely for discussion. Well, all right. So we are amongst ourselves. My name is Friso Wiersum. I was invited by IMPAKT to moderate this session. And we have 3 splendid speakers here. Emillie V, Keulenaar, Florian Cramer, Tomislav Medak, whom I'll introduce a bit later. Because a short welcome on both the panel and the exposition will be done by somebody else, not me. The 2 curators of both the show and the panel are Renata and Irena. They are both sitting there. Shall we give them a warm round of applause while one of them is stepping forward?
Hello, thank you very much for coming and for being here. And thank you IMPAKT for having us here, because this is really a nice opportunity to try to frame everything together, especially on the issue of post-truth. And as you already mentioned, for us it was interesting when thinking about this issue to address the Orwell's 1984, and for us the Ministry of Truth was actually quite inspirational, and this is why we decided to take these 2 departments. There are of course more departments, but in a way when you think that his Ministry of Truth was actually dealing with, you know, news, entertainment, education, and fine arts, then this kind of also has sense to kind of try to transfer it and think critically all those issues through these departments. So I would also really like to invite you to the exhibition, which will follow at 5, and this is it for now. And thank you very much to panelists for being here. It is really, I'm looking forward to the talk. Okay.
Thank you very much. So, as things happen on days like this, I'll also outline a little bit what we'll be doing. We'll have 3 short introductions. Tomislav will kick off. Then we have, it almost seems arranged, Florian. Then we have Emillie. Those presentations are, you have been invited to keep them under 10 minutes. Afterwards, I have prepared a little set of questions. I hope you also have questions. Let's make this as interactive as possible, as we're not hundreds of thousands of people. And it was announced in all the leaflets that it would be a panel discussion on misinformation, alternative facts, fake news, and information manipulation. We have decided that we will also focus very much on the power and political side to it. We have actually thought of that we would have a bunch of questions relating to the language, the form of the language, and to the political and the political organization part of the topic at hand. So bear with us. Kicking off and already breaking with the invitation, because I suppose that you were all invited not to speak from behind the laptop. Tomislav. There we go. Tomislav.
I have my notes.
Tomislav Medak, arriving today from Coventry, where you're currently a PhD researcher in the Coventry University Center for Post-Digital Cultures. But before, always active at various places, most notably in Zagreb's multimedia Mama Cultural Center, where you were a member of the theory and publishing team. You're a member of the performing arts collective Bad Co, an amateur librarian for the memory of the world, and your main topics that you research are technology, capitalist development, and post-capitalist transition. You have a presentation that you're going to read out from your laptop.
No, I'm not going to read out.
Oh, okay.
Those are just my notes.
Good. So then, take it away.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to thank to the organizers for inviting me, particularly Renata and Irena. So I'm going to make 5 short points, so hopefully they're short enough that I make it in 10 minutes. So first, it's maybe an analogy. So Benjamin in 1930s writes about cinema in the context of rise of fascism. And at the end of his artwork essay, he has the following to say. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure, which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their rights, but instead a chance to express themselves. So he speaks about cinema, and proletarian masses see themselves as a collective subjectivity in cinema, yet fascism manages to recode that experience into experience that is, in that sense, collectivist, corporativist, and works for the purposes of fascism. So, skipping forward into the 90s, so I would say that internet entered the phase of its mass adoption at the period of peak liberal capitalism. It was post-1989, the fall of wall, and it was a Fukuyamian moment of the end of history. Liberal capitalism became hegemonic, or so it was thought. And internet was very much bred into this historic moment. It kind of emerged with this moment as a mass medium of its time, just as cinema was mass medium of its time in the 30s. And it's not surprising that certain values were inscribed into internet as a medium. First and foremost, the notion of freedom. So it's the fundamental legitimational notion of all the movements and social initiatives related to the internet, and many elements of its history, of its becoming genealogy, are interpreted in terms of freedom. And then other values that relate to liberal subjectivity. So it's not surprising either that now, as we find ourselves at the moment of deep crisis of liberal capitalism, and its legitimational crisis, that internet is going through sort of deep skepticism or deep legitimational crisis too. So when we talk about post-factual, post-truth, fake news, it's frequently that we understand internet primarily as a medium of communication. And this is the first point I want to make. We can't see systems of communication in isolation from economic production, distribution systems. If you just think historically back to post office or postal service, what postal service has enabled is an element of coordination in the period of emerging capitalism that required some form of coordination and integration. And from there you had this development of distribution systems and so on and so forth. True, internet at its early days was promising more than just to be means of communication. It was also promising to be a means of redistribution of certain elements of social goods. However, 25 years later or 3 decades later, we can say that internet has been central in a number of processes that mark the present as a moment of social crisis. And These processes were globalization of capital flows and production chains, the rise of what is, according to Shoshana Zuboff, called surveillance capitalism, and ultimately technological integration, all processes that have effectively eviscerated capacity of democratic systems to control economic processes. So in analogy to Benjamin, we could today say internet as a means of communication is the internet of the proletarian masses. It's poor man's internet. Whereas the internet that presides over economic restructuring is the internet of the capital. Digital capitalism gives masses a means of expression and not the means for eliminating the economic structure which they might strive to eliminate. So let's situate more specifically internet, and this is my second point. What is internet as a mature capitalist economy? So when you look at where the large internet giants are based, they are based in Marxian analysis in something that we would call a commodity circuit. So they are focused on retail, advertising, distribution. So Google, Facebook, Amazon.com, JD.com, and Alibaba are the largest internet companies present, and they command the commodity circle. Google and Facebook command 2/3 of the online and 1/4 of the entire advertising market globally. Amazon.com alone commands 1/2 of the US online retail market and effectively provides the platform for most of the rest. So if we look at the importance of that they are situated in this part of the whole process of accumulation, there are two important consequences. First, internet has contributed and benefited from restructuring of the capitalist world system over the last 3 decades, where commodity and financial capital command the productive capital. They command the manufacture. This has had a number of economic effects. Obviously, deindustrialization, but also importantly, shifting of profits from the manufacturer to these companies. Also, this has resulted in stagnancy of productivity of most manufacture, process of monopolization, and solidification of offshore banking. But more maybe germane of our discussion here today, the internet giants have undercut the model of media systems that existed up to that point. They first offered difficult to monetize content channels, and then they offered ways to monetize them through restructuring advertising. You know? Google's introduction of personalized advertising platforms, AdWords and AdSense, contextual advertising, has been fundamental shift because throughout the 90s, policymakers were looking at what's the economic model to sustain economy in digital networks. And there it was. Another big important element was probably Amazon's decision to approach the design of its systems in such a way that is highly bureaucratic and that allowed for scaling. Going back to journalism. So digital journalism has hardly compensated for the losses that old media system has made. Just the other day, there was the news that BuzzFeed, Vice, Huffington Post are slashing some 2,000 jobs. And according to Guardian, between 2008 and 2017, newsroom jobs in the US newspapers dropped by 45%. It is no different elsewhere. I can tell you in Croatia, same thing. Okay, so these are the effects of the fact that mature internet economy is situated in commodity circuit. Third point, post-truth is in the eye of the beholder, primarily mainstream media, so the old media system. So we reserve adjectives, fake, news, post-truth, post-factual, mostly for internet media, social networks, and various other fora that exist in the digital sphere. However, the major fabricators of fake news are mainstream press and broadcast media. Recently, two political scientists at the, I think it's the University of Southampton, Justin Murphy and Daniel Devine, have made a study that has shown that the public support for Farage and UKIP, and also Robinson and EDL, has come as a consequence of mainstream media giving them coverage, and not vice versa. They didn't receive coverage because they had public support. They were made, in a way, publicly relevant. One could also see that in accusations of anti-Semitism leveled against Corbyn, but also, maybe polemically, Guardian has also threaded sort of a thin line with its reporting on Cambridge Analytica, which is a company basically doing bribing and not so much big data. And there was no quintessentially a proof that their collection and manipulation of big data had any effect on electoral outcomes. So it's no surprise that old press, in particular press media, would see internet media, digital journalism as a problem. No, it's self-justificatory action on their behalf. But also the problem is in the media system itself, because it harbors close ties between media barons and politicians, media barons and economic elites. Natalie Fenton and Des Frieden, two scholars from Guardian, have been saying what we have is not fake news, we have fake democracy. And their proposal is that we go back and overhaul the media literacy and media production system so that it works with people out there to re-embed news reporting in the lives of those people, to give them voice and to give also perspective to what is relevant to their lives. So I would say that media system is irreparably broken. We can't go back to the idea that free markets vouchsafe freedom of the press. That no longer holds, or if it ever held. And obviously there has been bleeding of journalist workforce from the media system, and it's lacking. No? Where's that reporting? We need to compensate that in some way, and we need to overhaul maybe fundamentally how we think media in political systems. Okay, fourth point. This is around the far right. However, there is undeniably a strong link between the uptake in the circulation of fake facts and news and the rise of far-right infosphere. It's nothing new. Croatian Wikipedia was captured by the revisionist right-wingers 10 years ago. The right wing has capacity to tactically use media just as the left does. It's not simply a progressive idea. It's the idea about the exclusion from the dominant media system. So you go out and find ways of putting your voice out. So far-right has been attempting to construct a political counter-narrative, both against the hegemonic liberal and old conservative establishment. The far-right, in doing so, has littered the internet with a dense nebula of interlinked false claims, moral panics, and conspiracy theories that act like a rabbit hole. But that, again, is not a new phenomenon. Jody Dean has analyzed that in the 90s, you had the phenomenon of aliens, FX Files, if you remember, but there was kind of an epidemic of people claiming that they were abducted by aliens. And she goes on to explain that it signals, first and foremost, in the context of rising internet and peak liberalism of Clintonite administration, that there is a deep distress in how democracy is being proceduralized, how it's being made technocratic, and that basically trust in aliens, belief in aliens, is a form of dissensus, showing that public reason is not homogenic. But to come to the crux of the matter, the current bubbling up of the far-right infosphere, with all its variations and specificities that merit analysis of their own, and Florian has done a lot of work on that, it has had a catalyzing moment, I think, in the pushback against the social struggles that have emerged since 2008 and that have started to rattle at the structure of class, race, and gender domination. Far-right's action are particularly focused on social justice warriors and cultural Marxists, feminists, queers, persons of color, leftists. If their actions have any bit of fascistic character, it is in what Alberto Toscano, drawing on Theodor Adorno, has described as conservative politics of antagonistic reproduction. Far-right purposefully distorts the claims and demands of those who are contesting the system, and thus it is providing legitimation for that system that has entered a deep crisis. And that crisis is, how am I doing with time?
Oh, you're over it.
I'm over it, okay. So let me just say briefly two brief things. I think that liberal order is breaking up because of accelerated instrumental rationality of globalized capital and technological change, which is particularly become non-integrable in democratic processes. In that sense, globalization doesn't work for most in economic terms, but also in political terms. And the rise of the right is basically an attempt to make globalization work again, but for some, not being the tide that lifts all boats, which has proven not correct, but basically something that works for the national bourgeoisies. And this explains Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, or Kurz. That's them in a nutshell. And as a last thing, and I'll conclude with this, facts are not simple, atomistic, matter-of-fact claims. They are complex and constructed. The process of constructing facts is frequently institutional, like in science, no? And they involve a process that establishes, ascertains, and falsifies. And only through that, facts are constructed. The authority that we give to those institutions is also the authority that we give to facts. However, particularly if you look at climate change, we can come back to that in the Q&A. If you look at climate change, it is clear that facts have strong normative demands. Scientists make strong social demands going forward. And this is what is being contested. So in a way, denialism works very similar in the fashion that far right works, no? As an antagonistic reproduction. Okay.
Thank you very much. So, very short question on this, and then please, if you have any questions, raise your hand. I'm coming over right away. If you're saying that the takeover that some people see happening on the internet by alt-right, far-right groups is nothing new, the new element might be the mistrust that general audiences have in institutions. Why would that be something that is actually happening only in this age? Well, there would be so much time and arguments to be very much mistrusting institutions before.
Well, I think there are a couple of processes at work there. First is that there is social complexity to the present societies that also has an institutional makeup. and then how those institutions work to the benefit of people, how they see them working to their benefit, and how that social division of labor works to their benefit is fundamental. No? And this is also what Jody Dean claims, that already in the 90s it was clear that space program, yeah, they sent the man on the moon, but that didn't bring a lot of change. Technology didn't bring a lot of change to the everyday life of most Americans. So in a way, distrust of institutions is very much the effect of distrust created by disaffection with what such institutional division of labor produces. That's, I think, one thing. Another thing is that that complexity is hard to grapple with for most of us. The understanding of the market is that you do something very fragmented, and ultimately it aggregates as a social whole, and that kind of creates a great society. No? That's capitalism at its best. But the problem is that particularly in education today, people encounter levels of demand to acquire deeply specialized knowledge in conditions that are hugely constrained by primarily exigencies of labor market and limitations of educational systems that do not compute. No? We need, in a way, far, far, far more education to be able to grapple with the level of complexity that is growing, I think. No? That's my, in a way, fundamental point, that instrumental rationality is increasing, and it's being disembedded from democratic decision-making. So I think these two elements contribute a lot to distrust of institutions. It's not that people are necessarily wrong in that distrust. It's just a larger question of how do we understand how to organize society, which is so complex.
I think we'll get back to this when we're speaking all together. Looking at you, whether there would be any questions for clarification to Tomislav. Well, that's very nice. So actually here the rational intelligence on a high level. Florian, while you're coughing and walking over to the laptop, I was instructed to stand right here so that people are not watching you. When I'm reading the little card of Introduction Florian, reader in 21st century visual culture, autonomous practices at Willem de Kooning Academy, Rotterdam. And the focus of Florian's research is on contemporary art and self-organized practices. You blog, you make videos, you also make films, and we should explicitly mention that you're a member of the core team of the chapter of political party Bijeen in Rotterdam. 10 minutes and a little more, because let's be fair, for you too.
Oh, no, I try to keep it short. And sorry, I'm just got the water into the wrong part of my digestive system. So can we switch to the presentation? I will directly continue where Tomislav left off, and I will also tell a little bit about, let's say, my own sentimental and cultural and intellectual background, because in the very beginning of this you ask, is anyone here in the room who identifies as alt-right or who is alt-right? And I think if I would give an honest answer about myself, if you translate this term alt-right into alternative right, then I would have to say that in my own influences, and I would probably suppose also in the intellectual influences, cultural influences of many people here, including this whole department of the humanities, there is actually a substantial influence and affinity to extreme right positions. And this year, I don't know whether anyone was able to identify this. This is Susie Sue from Susie and the Banshees, one of the first generation British punks. before she became better known as a musician herself. And this is how she posed. This was Sid Vicious. I think that this is known as well. Of course, you have to see it in a context, in a context of provocation, of transgression, also particularly in the context of British post-war history, of, let's say, a parent's generation that still had fought against the Germans and the children's generation then provoking them. But still, I mean, when for example, then punk came over from America and Britain to continental Europe, many people read the swastikas quite literally. And I think in any punk scene, I can say that myself from having grown up in post-punk culture in the 1980s, the fascists were always around the corner. I'm not saying this myself, this is a quote, I think, I'm not sure by whom, but somebody wrote it. And that's not just true for the punk scenes, but also for the artistic avant-garde. I mean, I guess most of you are familiar with Marinetti and Futurism, so really the beginning of the modernist avant-garde. And this is the 8th paragraph of the Futurist Manifesto from 1999. We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, the beautiful ideas that kill and scorn for women, right? Today, you could copy and paste that one-to-one and turn it into an alt-right meme. You wouldn't have to change a single word in this. And it was an alternative right itself. It was not the mainstream right. It was also a right that had strong, let's say, anarchist and contrarian elements. Fast forward back to the 1980s. This is by, now we go a little bit also, let's say, in the cultural origins of, for example, institutions like V2 in the Netherlands, or also IMPAKT, you know, the beginnings of media art. Much of that came out of the kind of industrial noise culture of the 1980s, which was very strong here. And one of the leading bands after Throbbing Gristle was White House, and they were always controversial for their flirtation with fascism. One of their members, Peter Sotos, published this zine in the early 1980s, and it starts with a quote by Joseph Goebbels, and then if you see the whole text and our search for the extremes, we're constantly bombarded with humanist, feminist, and other equally asinine diatribes that writers employ to alleviate the strain on their conscience or to try and seduce us into their maudlin world of false securities and self-contempt. You know, all this, again, this could be translated one-to-one into the contemporary alt-right discourse, and if I would have more time, I could even show you that partly it's the same people. Yeah? Many of those countercultural, let's say, fascist, flirtation, transgressive writers of the 1980s, for example, are now being used in the American alt-right as kind of canonical sources, for example, in the Proud Boys movement and others. But we don't just need to stay, let's say, on the nominal flirtation with fascism. If we talk about the whole complex of fake news and media manipulation and alternative narratives, then this, for example, this book by William Burroughs, who, by the way, was the great inspiration of the industrial music movement in the 1980s, of White House and others, is basically a manual how to produce fake news and how to produce smear campaigns as media subversion. You know? This is where the whole idea of the media guerrilla comes from. And you could argue these ideas could always be taken to the left or to the right. I could shoot more examples of those. And then, again, I try to keep it under 10 minutes. If we go into philosophy, then we can say, of course, if we go into the whole complex of post-structuralist, also partly postmodern, even including feminist and radical political left thought since roughly the 1960s, there has been a strong influence, or even a substantial influence by thinkers from the political right, including Heidegger and Nietzsche, for example, who were absolutely instrumental for what became the French philosophy of the 1960s, or Carl Schmitt. If you are familiar, for example, with Chantal Mouffe's political philosophy, it's a kind of appropriation, you could say a left-wing appropriation of Schmitt's notion of the enemy and constructing the enemy and contrarianism in politics. By the way, this is a biography by Jan Werner Müller on Schmidt, and Jan Werner Müller is also a political scientist who wrote one of the, let's say, canonical book on political populism. A really interesting figure in that context, and now I go a little bit into my own German past, is this person, Armin Mohler, who was a secretary of Ernst Jünger in the 1940s. This is a portrait of him in the 1940s, who forged, or you could say almost this meme, coined this meme in the post-war period, called the Conservative Revolution. What he really meant with the Conservative Revolution was not mainstream conservatism, but was basically pre-war and post-war, you could say, power, proto, and real fascist intellectual thinking, including Carl Schmitt, by the way. Armin Mohler became the founder of the so-called neo-right in Germany, which then also spilled over into France as the so-called Nouvelle Droite. And then we are really in a straight lineage to what the so-called alternative right and the new right is today. I should also mention, just for those of you who are here in the humanities department, Armin Mohler was a student, oh my goodness, of Jakob Taubes, just for those of you who are familiar with him as actually a Jewish political philosopher. And Jakob Taubes, who was, let's say, the teacher of many German post-structuralist and postmodern thinkers, including Norbert Bolz, by the way, who has turned to the extreme right just recently. And by the way, just to mention another intellectual figure, not coming from Mohler or Taubes, but someone who was a professor here in Utrecht for many years, Helmut Layton. I'm not sure, is here anyone who worked with Helmut Layton, by any chance? He's now he's still on the political left, but he has become a controversial figure because his wife is one of the main intellectual activists of the identitarian movement. And there has been an article recently who said that he and his wife collaborated on, let's say, her political career and exposure. So Mohler was, let's say, his lifelong project was, and he self-identified as a fascist, as an intellectual fascist, openly in a text that he wrote, was to establish this idea of the neo-right, which became the Nouvelle Droite in France in the late 1960s, early 1970s, with, among others, Alain de Benoist as a chief thinker, who came also up with the idea of basically appropriating Gramscian thought for the right and gaining political hegemony. So what you described, Tomislav, these are also strategies that were developed in that time. Here we have his manifesto he co-authored for European Renaissance, which then was straightforwardly imported into the American alt-right, namely the American Renaissance of Jared Taylor, one of the leading white supremacist thinkers and who identifies as alt-right himself, and was also the person that Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands had dinner with. Maybe some of you have read this. So it's not, let's say, that the alt-right is something new. Let's say it's a new brand for an old movement. Whereas, let's say, the lineage that I made from Mohler to Taylor is rather one of the older men. Let's say the younger men are these, the identitarian movement in France, Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands, Identitaire Verzet in the Netherlands, which then has been again taken up by one of the alt-right groups in America called Identity Europa. They were one of the groups that were part of the Charlottesville Rally, Unite the Right. And here we have Thierry Baudet, the Dutch extreme right politician wearing Paper the Frog. This meme was not constructed by himself, but he, after he saw it, he spread it himself. So we know today that basically the whole movement of the so-called new right, maybe that's even a better term to use than alt-right. There's also a very good book by a Belgian political scientist, Ico Mali, and it's called in Dutch Nieuw Rechts, and perhaps that's a better term because it allows us to see, let's say, the big trajectories and see also the ideological movements back and forth between Europe and America and the larger discourse that is behind it. That, I think, needs to be reflected as something that has all kinds of different manifestations. Here we are in the area of politics, but it also had its manifestations or its kind of outliers in contemporary art, in subcultures, in pop cultures, etc., and very often also being in gray zones. I think what basically the whole alt-right strategy is, but also the so-called fake news strategies, is to create zones of insecurity or of blurriness in this way achieve a hegemonic intervention by for example, making people doubt, is that serious or is it not serious? Is it a joke or not? Is this really fascism or is it just a kind of parodistic fascism? Is this transgressive? Is it a quote? Is it postmodern? And these strategies have also been used by non-fascist groups. I mean, you come from ex-Yugoslavia, from Zagreb, and just the next country is Slovenia. And if you look at the whole strategies that have been used by Leibach and Neue Slowenische Kunst, that was also dressing up as fascist and even getting fun out of the fact that they had neo-Nazis cheering at their concerts and working with the same kind of blurriness. So I think we need to have a conversation about these strategies. Yeah? And we also need to have a conversation about these intellectual histories without completely denouncing them. Because I would still say, for example, Carl Schmitt is an incredibly interesting political thinker. Never mind the fact that he was one of the intellectual architects of the Third Reich. So, I leave the rest to our discussion.
Thank you very much.
Do you say within 10 minutes?
Almost.
Almost, okay.
Well, I will not be a fascist on time. Just a simple question. The alt-right, because let's stick to alt-right as this was the word used in the announcements of this panel. Do you think it could have remained a subculture rather than being a very present force in analysis?
I think that's what they tried. I mean, that's basically what the alt-right tried, to establish it as a subculture first and foremost. And then rather use, for example, gamer culture, meme culture as the kind of vehicle. And you could argue that, for example, online meme culture, as it has existed on 4chan for now quite some time, is something like a contemporary punk phenomenon with many parallels to what happened in the 70s, which I showed on the previous slides. I think that actually since 2016, the thing is they could do that because they were operating underneath the radar. And they haven't been able to do that since 2016, since there has been a lot of public exposure, also investigative journalism, and it actually has become a political movement. Prior to that, so let's say prior to Charlottesville, it was a kind of hegemonic attempt, again, with Carl Schmitt or Chantal Mouffe, to kind of seize this whole terrain of subcultures that had reactionary tendencies. Yeah, such as the Gamergate subculture and others. And it was quite similar to the playbook that neo-Nazis already had used in the 1980s when they, for example, tried to integrate hooligan and skinhead culture. And again, if you look at ex-Yugoslavia and, for example, how in Serbia, actually the militant football hooligans became the kind of forefront of the civil war, then you can see that these are not harmless strategies at all.
Or in
the Minister of Culture, who comes from the new right intellectual milieu, and he was a hooligan as well. So I mean, he's also Muslim. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Looking at you again, people, if there would be a question of clarification or adding a few people that you have not seen in the slideshow of Florian. Yes, I'm walking over.
Well, maybe just a comment about that new right would be a better term for alt-right. It kind of neglects then how alt-right maybe is connected to our current internet, the new communication environments that we're in, and as I see it, is also very much benefiting and using those structures. That would, for me, be a reason to use alt-right and not new right. How do you relate to that?
Yeah, I think you could say the alt-right is the kind of American branding of it. And if you compare, let's say, the contemporary young pop cultural extreme right in America to that one in Europe, you could say in America it's incredibly good with the internet. And it blows up at the moment where they go on the street, then something like Charlottesville happens. And here it's exactly the other way around. Here you have, for example, the identitarians who are really good at staging actions in public space, but they're not as internet savvy. But in the end, they are the same movement. Yeah? So maybe look at something like alt-right as a branch or a brand or a subgroup of a larger movement. But I would absolutely see the kind of, let's say, the bigger picture, yeah? That the alt-right is not a movement by itself, but it's part of a larger extreme right tendency and network, actually. Yeah? And for example, I talked about Alain de Benoist as the founder of the French Nouvelle Droite, the New Right. Richard Spencer, who was the coiner of the term alt-right, invited him to one of his congresses in America. Yeah? So these are not at all coincidental overlaps.
With your consent, shall we continue right away to the third presentation so we have a bit more time for a discussion amongst Tree and you? Yeah? Emily, I'm going to stand here because you need to switch something on the laptop, and then I'll do a little dance so that people are not looking at you doing this. Emily stressed that she has many things because this card is completely filled with her biography. She was born in 1992. So this is all fake news. Here we go. She obtained the MA, magna cum laude, in history and political thought and in media culture. Currently, she is a postgraduate at the University of Amsterdam at the New Media and Digital Culture. She's doing research for two institutions there, the Open Intelligence Lab and the CREATE team. The CREATE team is on artificial intelligence on humanities. We'll save that for another panel discussion. And in the OI lab, she's studying political subcultures, especially the new far right, digital and intellectual culture. And I suppose this is what your presentation is going to be about. So I'm going to pass you this microphone. It might be easier.
That's what I thought. At a certain point, I thought I had to take the one on the floor. Yeah, well, thank you very much for the presentation. And it's great to be here and to be able to, well, talk to you guys a little bit about that. Well, I was told I needed to give a little bit of a background about what kind of practice that I'm involved in with the research group that I work for, so OI Lab. And I think that could be a great introduction also to a sort of case study that I'll present to you, and that I think Florian and Tomislav's presentation will have contextualized really well already. So as was said, I'm part of this research collective that's called the Open Intelligence Lab. We're part of the Amsterdam University, the University of Amsterdam, which is also associated to the Digital Methods Initiative. And traditionally what the Digital Methods Initiative does, and what we do together with them, is to try to figure out digital culture online. Traditionally, how we do that is we look into big social media platforms or really consequent digital platforms, not just because there is a lot of digital culture to decipher there, and because also there's something very interesting about the technical dimension or the material dimension of those platforms where people act and do what they say and you know, have their particular political cultures, but also because, of course, it has a lot of data and it's a great source of users that we can then you know, do quite consequent research about. The thing is, with OI Lab, what we have, you know, developed an impression about is that it would be necessary, at least if we look into a movement like the alt-right or globally new online far-right movements, that we look into another kind of alternative web, in a sense. And this is necessary in the sense that if alt-right users need to be better able to express themselves, then traditional social media platforms would not be too useful in the sense that they're very well governed by, or not too well governed, but they are governed by hate speech laws, right? And so you might have heard, of course, a lot of recent scandals where they've, had to execute a series of crackdowns on far-right users and hate speech content, where those particular users have then migrated to other platforms, so other kinds of alternative platforms. One of them is Gab, as you can see here, as an alternative to Twitter, but also good old 4chan, which has been around not just recently, but for at least 2002, 2004. And that kind of part of the web, that sort of alternative part of the web, is then governed by correspondingly different speech cultures, where these alt-right users would be most able to express themselves due to more loose and relaxed speech regulations, and also due to the lack of necessity for them to identify themselves. For instance, on 4chan, you don't need to register as a user, you don't need to confirm your email, you don't have to use a new username, you don't have a user profile, so you can sort of play with your identity and even political identity. You don't need to associate what you do on the platform with who you are, as a user. So there is a lot of political experimentation there, especially on the far right. These are the platforms that we have focused in, and these are the platforms that we associate to what we call the deep vernacular web, which is this part of the web where you will find this majority of messaging boards or image boards like 4chan, and where most of these users are positioned nowadays, and where a lot of digital culture, like Florian mentioned, originates from, especially the alt-right. But what we have also noticed with regards to this discussion about post-truth and alternative facts and fake news is that there's also another kind of alternative web for another aspect, so another key facet of the web, which are online encyclopedias. So what we have seen with a recent research project that we've been doing for the past year is that there have been a number of editors on Wikipedia that have felt somewhat discriminated for their political viewpoints, and that due to their particular disappointment, migrate or go on to create their own alternative Wikipedias. And in this particular slide, you'll see Metapedia here, or Infogalactic, and Rightpedia. And Metapedia is, in a sense, trying to do justice, well, all of them are, in a sense, by migrating from Wikipedia and trying to create an alternative to Wikipedia, trying to do justice to a certain political vision of what they think is good knowledge or good facts as a consequence. So here Metapedia, you'll see, has been created quite early. Never mind the other wikis, because there are a lot of them, but for the purpose of just this presentation, I'll focus on at least three, so Rightpedia, Metapedia, and Infogalactic. They've been created quite early. Then Infogalactic follows on, and Rightpedia follows on. Metapedia, just as a background, is interested in trying to do justice, so to say, to what they call pro-European culture and European civilization. So they have a lot of articles that are particularly focused on, well, subjects that we know are of interest to globally far-right political discussions. Rightpedia considers itself a sort of repertoire of conspiracy theories that they would like to advance and prove as being legitimate. And Infogalactic is a kind of wiki that, out of disappointment with Wikipedia's editorial policies, tries to, in a sort of alt-light vein, tries to give voice to alternative political viewpoints in many different template realizations. And so, another thing I would like to say about these wikis is that what's interesting about them is that the way they are created is that they fork from Wikipedia, which is this, as many of you might know it, a software term that means then that certain users will import certain back-end and front-end features from Wikipedia, such as the template, but also such as how the template works on the back-end. And what happens then, what's interesting is that as they kind of create the alternative wikis, they also go on to rewrite, as they fork from Wikipedia, they also go on as to rewrite some of the content that is originally taken from Wikipedia. So what this visualization here shows is, in the little dots, are the quantities of edits for a particular article that was on race and intelligence And it was initiated, as you can see, in 2004, 2005 in Wikipedia. What happens then is that Metapedia, certain users of Metapedia, ditch Wikipedia. They're completely unsatisfied with the editorial policies of Wikipedia, as they create their own article on race and intelligence, of course, with their own political background. They take a little bit of the content from Wikipedia here, but then they go on to write about it, to modify it with different sources, different authors, and different facts, so to say, or information that then goes on to prove a particular political viewpoint that they have about race and intelligence, which is, for instance, that there is a correlation about race and, between race and intelligence that Wikipedia would not prove adequately. And the same thing happens then with other wikis, so Infogalactic and Writepedia. I actually have a slide that shows this process, how they go on about rewriting that page, but I'm not sure I still have time. Yeah? Okay. So in that sense, I'm going to have to do something quite a bit quirky here, because I'm going to have to go back to a slide that I didn't consider I would use, given the time constraints. Here it is. Hopefully it will work. So what happens in this slide, there it is. Okay, just as a particular, just a little, so this slide basically illustrates a little story that I think is worth giving a little bit of a background to. So this is the story of how the article from Wikipedia, it gets rewritten on Infogalactic. And what the story tells, and I'll tell you the story in the meantime as I play the video. It might be a little bit desynchronized, but just follow me if you can. Is that there is a particular user in 2016 on Wikipedia called Psalm19 that would like to post a number of information. Here it is, Psalm19. They would like to post a couple of information about race and intelligence on the race and intelligence page on Wikipedia that goes on to prove subtly with certain new sources, new facts, that there is a correlation between race and intelligence. And as he tries to do that, of course, he gets sanctioned for it. Well, editors from Wikipedia say that, well, you're just being completely unprofessional here. We're not taking you seriously because what you're doing is you're posting pseudoscience, and so we're banning you. Eventually, he gets banned. So what does he do? He goes to Infogalactic. And then on Infogalactic, he restarts the original page. So he copies the entire content that you see original on Wikipedia, see? And then he starts erasing everything and then rewriting all of that into what is originally Wikipedia's viewpoint on the subject, that is mostly a sort of intellectual, historical presentation of the debate, of an erroneous debate that took place on race and intelligence, to what becomes eventually on Infogalactic's page an actual active debate proving that there is a correlation between race and intelligence and that it is a valid point to be debated today. So that's an example of the way that they rewrite these things and that they come with their own alternative facts, so to say. And the same thing happens, for instance, with the Holocaust. This is a massively re-edited page in that a lot of these alternative wikis consider it, of course, not to have ever happened. And so they focus especially on historical facts and in presenting new historical facts that would then go on to prove that that particular genocide never happened at all. And what we found interesting then in the end about these alternative wikis is not just that they are populated by different content, but they're also populated by different ideas as to what good or legitimate knowledge is. And in that way that they associate particularly a value of objectivity with justice, in the sense that they are created themselves in order to do justice to a kind of knowledge that they think is ignored or misrepresented by a certain power or establishment, for instance, Wikipedia, and that they would then like to present it fairly. So as you see in this graph in particular, these are the values that we extracted from the content guideline pages of all the alternative wikis. They don't have much in common, as you can see. Only the word encyclopedia is between all of the different wikis, Infogalactic, Writepedia, Wikipedia, Metapedia. But a couple of other values that they have in common are, for instance, that you consider all of themselves to be fair. and objective and accurate and fair and objective about that particular viewpoint they would like to give light to, as opposed to Wikipedia, or in contestation against Wikipedia's ignorance or disinterest in their particular viewpoints, political viewpoints. So our conclusion in that sense was that Altpedias are a sort of an example of a more political instrumentalization of facts, in the sense that they're just not necessarily just used to describe a particular reality, but they're also used to substantiate realities that different political groups think are ignored by other dominant political groups. And that, in that sense, Altpedias are not just marked by disagreements regarding content and what content should be there, or what content is true, etc., but also as to what they deem is worthy of knowledge at all, and what they can't know correspondingly by default of their political viewpoints. And so it's not necessarily that these Altpedias and similar realizations online are an evidence of the, a sort of obsolescence of truth, but rather that these kinds of standard compendiums of knowledge, like Wikipedia, are now coexisting with alternative partisan compendiums of knowledge of their own. And thank you.
Let us see whether the other microphones work too. Yes, they do. Emily, when Florian was finishing his presentation, he said that actually what is a strategy is creating these zones where insecurity is reigning. And you're saying that these are also alternative, sorry to use that word, encyclopedias. Is that the same procedure? Because the people that are posting on the other encyclopedias are, of course, trying to put insecurity on the people that believe Wikipedia to be true?
I'm not sure I understood the first part of the question, that there are different zones?
No, but if a strategy is creating zones of insecurity, so what to believe or what not to believe, yeah.
I'm not sure that they really try to... Well, you could say maybe that they create zones of insecurity with Wikipedia in that maybe they would like to troll it. You know, for instance, there have been multiple attempts by these moderators or by these editors who have been banned from Wikipedia, initially to change the complete content of Wikipedias with a joke or a troll, changing, for instance, an article about Marx into something like a critique of Marx or a parody of Marx or something like that. Maybe in that sense there is a sense, an attempt at delegitimizing it as such, But I think maybe the most concrete evidence that they try to destabilize Wikipedia is by the mere fact that they try to compete with it, with alternative, sources of knowledge and viewpoints and facts and so on that users might find in them and not in Wikipedia. And fortunately enough, these alternative wikis are not so popular. They don't have a lot of users. But we do see them being quoted then and now, and then and again in multiple alt-right spaces on 4chan and so on.
So then, if I would be comparing Wikipedia to the liberal hegemony that actually ended somewhere around perhaps 2011, if we take it very late, the crisis of this liberal hegemony ended up in a lot of subcultures emerging and battling for the right to be on the foreground. Would you agree on Wikipedia perhaps being the symbol of a humanist liberal hegemony? Because I think that would be important to agree upon.
Well, the interesting thing is that Wikipedia actually came from the political right. A few people know that. Jim Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, was an avid follower of Ayn Rand, and Wikipedia was supposed to be the manifestation of Ayn Randian objectivist philosophy in an online system. It went a different way, you could say, but actually...
I think it's...
But, I think I would rephrase it. I think we can say that in this whole history of the internet, which you also sketched in your lecture, Tomislav, from the 1990s till the beginning of the 2010s, there was something like a collusion or unquestioned coalitions between libertarians, liberals, and other lefts. And these coalitions no longer work today. So projects like Wikipedia, or also open source software, for example, or internet activism, could be supported by people who identified as socialists, as Ayn Randian libertarians, or as centrist liberals. And that kind of consensus is not possible anymore.
I would also add that it's interesting to think that Wikipedia, at least in how it was designed, was supposed to afford all sorts of different political opinions. That on the back end, so where the editors and the moderators come together to discuss what kind of content they think is better to put on the page. That in that context, Wikipedia would work under an idea of political consensus, right? That all these different political affiliations would come together in the editing room and so on. But what's interesting then with the content that we showed, on the Holocaust and on race and intelligence, is that I think for certain editors, Wikipedia only goes that their tolerance, so to say, only goes to a certain extent. That this idea of having multiple perspectives and so on the editing board only goes to a certain extent, and that it comes to an end in these particular when it has to welcome or when it has to deal with ideas, such extreme, far-right ideas like race and intelligence and eugenics and so on, and that they would need a completely new Wikipedia in that sense in order for those ideas to come to light.
So, may I, if you want to react, because you were talking about how facts are constructs, no? And if we see Wikipedia, you can really see by the line of moderation and edits that it is a construct. Would it be possible to present facts with various views on that perhaps little thing that everybody agrees on Wikipedia, or would that be contrarian to the back end of Wikipedia?
That, sorry, Tomislav, you wanted to say something? That, just to recapitulate, the different facts are?
So, for example, if you take the case of the Holocaust, that particular genocide, you could say it happened during the Nazi regime is what percent of scholars agree upon. Yeah. That could be 99%, but of course there could be a few people that differ, and we list them here, and then people are allowed to comment on there, rather than chase them away to alternative encyclopedias. But perhaps this is just a very strange question.
Yeah, I mean, it would, in a sense, then you would be allowing for something like hate speech to come to fruition, in Wikipedia. There are policies on Wikipedia that don't allow this kind of content to be shown for obvious and legitimate reasons, I think. And there are certain things that Wikipedia thinks it cannot afford. For instance, hoaxes and conspiracies and so on, they don't allow. And these other alternative historical facts, which of course to me are not facts at all, but to them they are, cannot be allowed in that sense, in the sense that they're classified as hoaxes. But it's interesting to think that, for instance, an alternative wiki like Infogalactic tries, endorses that experiments with the idea that we're implying here, that a Wikipedia doesn't just need to have a diverse amount of content, but also diverse amount of perspectives on the template itself. So that you could see it immediately on the article. You could transpire the multiplicity of ideas about a particular subject immediately on the template. But I'm not sure if it really works as an experiment.
I think that facts exist in political cultures, and you can have parallel political cultures that give context to the facts and how they're presented. In former Yugoslavia, it's very clear that what national Wikipedias have allowed is sort of a form of free expression of national spirit that was supposedly suppressed before. And you have currently alternative Wikipedias. You have Croatian Wikipedia, you have Serbian Wikipedia, and you have Serbo-Croat Wikipedia. And in a way, Serbo-Croat Wikipedia comes from an angle which you could say is embedded in the point of view of former Yugoslavia. No, in that sense, it comes from a very different political culture, and articles would be radically different on interpreting particularly historic items, but also cultural items. I think Wikimedia has tried to grapple with many of these things. So Wikipedia exists also as an organization. They have tried to mediate, for instance, historical revisionism on Croatian Wikipedia. They have failed in doing so. Recently I was contacted again by somebody in Wikimedia trying to reestablish that process of mediation, but I think that battle has been lost long time ago. And national Wikipedia's function, national culture, Croatian national culture has shifted to the right radically over the last 2-3 decades, over the last 2-3 years in particular. Now we have had a Minister of Culture who himself is avowed pro-fascist, pro-Ustasha, to be correct, and who is also the translator and publisher of Alain de Benoist, Norman Finkelstein as well, so it's kind of strange, but that's how these things work. There is sort of zone of blurring, as Florian has suggested. I guess internet in that sense, in these particular languages and cultures, is no better than the rest of the media landscape and political culture.
But maybe Wikipedia is a good example to show how knowledge is a contested area where different hegemonical attempts are being played out. Because we could describe the same from the left, right? For example, if you look at Wikipedia, there's a gross underrepresentation, for example, of articles on women and women artists, among others, or philosophers. And there are also feminist attempts to write these articles. And these are also interventions into Wikipedia. Now, we could even, we are here in the vicinity of the most important gender studies departments in the Netherlands. The establishment of an academic discipline, gender studies or post-colonial studies, etc., of course, has been the result of a political hegemonic intervention into the field of knowledge and education since the 1960s. What's happening now is that the same hegemonic or the same type of hegemonic intervention is coming from the political right, and including the extreme right. And I must say, I expect this intervention to bear fruit in maybe 10 or 20 years. Yeah, we will see those departments. I'm pretty sure about that.
The one thing that perhaps, if I may intervene, is there used to be a certain, this also is going to be my political principle here, there used to be a certain logic in extending faculties at universities or Wikipedias to a more diverse angle, because this is something that we all believed in, as progress would be inevitable. And now it seems that this progress has been stopped, and suddenly we're in this loop again where we're fighting languages and political movements that we thought were gone. Please, your comments on this.
That I agree. No, yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that it's as when we were talking, for instance, in the instance of how much can Wikipedia possibly afford, even though it's designed to afford a multiplicity of political viewpoints and many different types of viewpoints in general. How much can the university today afford to have? I think, in a sense, the return of the far right as such is the return of what we have, at least in Europe, really always tried to contain as much as possible. And now that it is here, maybe 20 centimeters from our face, in a sense, you have a moral obligation not to allow that kind of content to come in. But yeah, now.
I have a counter argument to that. You can say, okay, you can approach that from a moral point of view, but you could also approach it from an intellectual point of view. And in my attempt to kind of compress an intellectual and cultural history of the extreme right, yeah, super short, I would say the point is, or let's say what or let's say an interesting paradox is that the extreme right had interesting thinkers and intellectuals and artists in the early 20th century, while as a whole not trying to be anti-intellectual. I think now we have exactly the opposite situation. The extreme right as a whole tries to be intellectual while not having good thinkers. You know, the best thing they have is Jordan Peterson, and that's fucking poor. Yeah, that's really the problem that they have. So I think you could, for example, say, well, maybe if a gender studies department was the result of political struggles on the left since the 1960s, maybe the result of the political struggles now on the extreme right could be an identity studies department in 10 or 20 years. I would not be surprised if we'll see that. Yeah? But then the question is, you know, whom do you appoint for that department? Who actually has even if you don't agree, even if you don't politically agree, at least has, let's say, an interesting or at least worth discussing contribution to an intellectual debate. Yeah? And clearly with feminism and postcolonial we have seen that because they have questions fundamental registers of epistemology. They had to go very deep in order to do that. So first of all, I want to see, you know, I want to see from the extreme right that they can do better than they're doing now. And before that, I cannot take them seriously. I can take them politically seriously, but I cannot take them intellectually seriously.
The problem there, I think, is that the right in the present, the far right in the present, is turned toward the past. No, and it's not new. We could say also that at the beginning of the 20th century, what they were looking back to is to get away from the modern world spurred on by capitalism, popular masses, democracy, technology. So all these factors contributed to these people going back to sources of sort of communalism, sovereignism, etc., that were pre-modern. No? And I think that world has been just erased. No, I think in that sense there are true alt-right thinkers that are trying to think the moment. Nick Land would be, for instance, one who is trying to think capitalism and technology have accelerated to such degree that the old structures of state no longer function, and we should get out of that world. So, but I would just want to say that there are already departments for kind of identitarianism, and those are mostly history departments, particularly in smaller countries. That's the problem of historiography, that it's usually national historiography. And it's going through a deep crisis exactly because the framing of enclosed nations doesn't work. But for instance, if you go to Croatia, historians would be, that Minister of Culture was also a historian, historians would be prime example where basically identitarianism of that sort is hashed out. And then the second problem, I think, is also what comes from the political system. And here I want to kind of put blame a little bit on the EU. EU has been key player in buttressing the narrative of two totalitarianisms, which has led in many places to equate anti-fascist struggles with local national fascist movements. This is happening now in Croatia, and the sole purpose of this, I guess Poland was the one who was pushing for this, and there is a resolution by European Union on this. In Croatia, this functions in the following way. You have pro-Ustasha people whose maybe parents were or grandparents were at the wrong side of history, though the sides of history are being again fought out, no? And they are basically trying to equate a genocidal racist regime with anti-fascist struggle and communists. And the whole purpose is basically absolving from historical responsibility their grandfathers. So I think, that's the problem. There exists a lot in the present that wants to rewrite the history. And for the left, the problem is the future. There is no hegemonizing narrative about the future on the left. And that's, so basically you have a third party there, and those would be liberals who are in the present. And they really have an easy day out by just confirming what is the social reality around us. No, that's why they are basically pushing back against all of those social movements that are questioning racial, gender, or class privilege, which is of structural nature. No, and
so I'm going to stop you here
sorry.
because I have two short questions, because I would also like to give the audience the opportunity to ask a few questions. We touch on two things here. Appropriation of language, and it has been argued that the alt-right has been leaning and stealing languages from the left.
I'm not sure. I don't
No, but there's going to be a question. So it was proposed that also progressives, perhaps better than left, should be stealing back strategies or words from the right in order to obtain the front side in the hegemonical battle. Secondly, European Union or European Parliament. We have a small question somewhere on a note like, what is the actual political influence of the alt-right? You were mentioning 2016, a lot of journalism came up after the election of Trump. Then you mentioned the Guardian articles on Cambridge Analytica, which you consider to be on thin ice as for journalism. There's elections, end of May, that might be decisive for a few years of the European Union coming up. So question to you, what would be a strategy for progressive stealing back strategies and languages from the alt-right? And what do you see happening in the battle on internet and also offline running up to the elections? And then after you have very shortly commented on these huge questions, I'm going to go there and ask a few comments. To all three of you, please. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just monopolize for a bit.
Well, I just wanted to add maybe in an intermediary point to your question, to what Florian and Tomislav were saying shortly before, that how, in a sense, intellectual history could be a really interesting approach to try and tackle with these new political movements, in the sense that, well, like we were saying before, there is a sort of moral obligation to try to oppose them or not give them a particular place in the public sphere or public spheres. But on the other hand, it's interesting to think that if we approach the far right in terms of a re-emergence, in terms of not just particular, political group or political network coming back to power, but also certain political ideas coming back to at least public relevance, so to say, and how they are already quite well spoken about and disseminated, for instance, in the 1930s in Europe, or we can think of the Weimar Republic and what followed afterwards, and of course other places in Europe. Well, then it's interesting to see that maybe there is something that hasn't been resolved in the kinds of historical debates that were set at that time, and maybe this is a reason why they have come back as such. And in that sense, an intellectual history instead of a direct critique or a no platformy strategy could allow us to try and dissolve or overcome the ideas that haven't been resolved at that time. You know, so for questions, for instance, as to what national identity means, or what ethnic identity means, or what race means, and things like that. You know, how do we feel about these questions, and what can the left say about that exactly? That could finally maybe put these questions to rest and not have the far right take the upper hand when it comes to these discussions. You know.
Florian wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I think actually that what you ask, these appropriations, let's say, of right-wing or even extreme right-wing ideas into the left has already happened. Yeah? So I already mentioned Chantal Mouffe. That's a good example. She did that. She does that in her political philosophy. Jacques Derrida did the same. You even could argue that, you know, if you go from philosophy into cultural movement, Afrofuturism is a way of actually turning European, including Italian futurism, into something quite different, right? So this has happened, and what I perceive as the stupidity of the current new right or alt-right, or what we want to call them, is that, you know, you have a Jordan Peterson who says, well, Foucault and Derrida are cultural Marxists. Well, first of all, he doesn't understand anything of them. I mean, it's really he's arguing on the level of a first-year undergrad student, where you would have to go through his paper and say, no, 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 read again. But if he would be really clever, he would say, well, actually, you know, the theory of power by Foucault, this is super interesting. And it's super interesting for the new right. We could appropriate that. I think you could even appropriate gender theory and post-colonial theory and turn it around. I mean, it was an attempt by Alain de Benoist. Well, ethnopluralism, you could say, you know, take ethnopluralism and combine it with post-colonial theory, and suddenly, I mean, there have been agreements, for example, with radical groups such as the Nation of Islam and extreme writers. You could push it that way also in other ways. If you say we all agree on the fact that we want to end colonialism and live separate lives, right? We could agree from a fascist point of view and from a post-colonial struggle point of view. At the moment, the extreme right is not smart enough to do that. If they would be smarter, they would do it, but I expect them to do it within the next 10 or 20 years. And then we're also talking about, let's say, more serious attempts, more serious journals, more serious articles, more serious university departments, etc.
Which point? Tomislav?
So I'm left with a question about European elections. So European Parliament doesn't have much say, I would say, in how EU policies are being made. It's much more Conference of Ministers that has a say in that. But what European elections serve for is to launch debates and parties where they have no space within the national political landscape. UKIP would be a good example, no? Because of a really weird electoral system that UK has. They haven't been able to enter the parliament, but they've been really making inroads in the European Parliament. And I would say, even on the progressive side, you know, you can look at what DiEM25 is doing, and that's more like a stage. The question is, whether Europe, you know, I think that that's the fundamental problem that, except for the very few, DiEM would be probably an exception. Europe has no normative perspective. I think Europe is lost. Maybe rightfully so. I must admit I'm to a degree Eurosceptic, or EU skeptic, to be exact. But yeah, that's, I think, a whole complex that is not easily resolved because the structure is there, and it has its capacity to regulate, so it's a terrain of struggle by all means. But I think that the coming European elections will be really a picnic day for conservative right and far right, also to a degree that left will suffer huge losses. But yeah.
So thank you for this. I'm coming over to you. It might be very challenging to come up with a question that is going to give us a hopeful answer before we are leaving here. Might be tough in these times of complex rationalities. Who will be the first person daring to ask a question? I'm seeing somebody on the third row. If you stick here, I'm going to walk with the microphone.
I had a question about sort of this weaponization of facts, because Emily, you talked a bit about it, about these alternative facts being truth to other people. And I don't know if I agree completely with that. And I'm wondering your opinion, because it feels like the alt-right and sort of this internet culture that is happening is also using these facts not as something they believe as truth, but also as this pointer to steer something in another direction. So it's not about these facts themselves. And that's really what I'm wondering now. If you compare the left at the moment and this alt-right, how they use these facts at the moment, do you think there's a big difference, or how is that progressing?
Well, I think, like Tomislav conveyed before, that you can see that maybe there are different kinds of facts or different ways of producing those facts. I think in the context of these, of Wikipedia or these alternative wikis, well, we could speak, for instance, of historical facts, disproving or proving a thing like the Holocaust. That would be one type of those. Well, as you yourself said, the alt-right sometimes, well, especially maybe probably under the spiritual guidance of Donald Trump, uses these facts as just a kind of distraction, or, well, as what they would call misinformation or disinformation instead. In that sense, it's not necessarily intended to be a fact, but it's intended to be something like, political propaganda, or a method of distracting the public towards some other kind of news or event or issue. I'm not sure that answers your question about the left. I have a very bad memory, so I tend to forget things quite easily.
Hold on, because it is being registered. That's why we need the microphones.
Then isn't it dangerous to call these facts alternative facts as a whole society? Isn't it normalizing the fact that these are not labeled as facts or intended as facts? Isn't it not? Are we then normalizing this whole shift to the right by legitimizing and talking as if we take them seriously, or as if we should take these facts seriously?
I agree with you that these facts are not plausible, right? And that they ought not to be given the same plausibility as other kinds of facts, for instance, the Holocaust again. And I think that it ought to be justified as such, in saying, well, these facts are more or less plausible. But I think in another way, given, as we said, many minutes ago, there is a need for as Florian actually particularly said, there is a need for a good informational literacy. There is a need for particular attention as to what kinds of strategies these new political groups come up with online, and how they use online tools to convey their political, or to mediate their political expression. And that also counts for something like information. I mean, how do we distinguish, something like misinformation to disinformation, to alternative facts, to fake news, and so on? There is, of course, I think, to me at least, the question here is a question of research or additional study and more intellectual attention given to this issue.
Maybe,
Short.
Yeah, really short. You could say, in a way, the construction of alternative facts taps into a weakness of, let's say, a simplified perception, for example, such as Foucault's discourse theory, that says knowledge is also something that's discursively produced. Facts are also discursively produced. And feminist or post-colonial studies would subscribe to that as well. Now, there's one weapon against that, and that's analytical philosophy. That's taking apart arguments by actually analyzing their logical construction. That has its own sets of problems, but maybe there needs to be a more serious look into these kind of methods as a way to not have yourself cornered with the argument that knowledge is a discursive production. And Tomislav, you as a philosopher might have an opinion on that.
So there is a famous example of Linus Pauling, so two-time Nobel Prize
Laureate.
Yeah, got it twice. He got it for peace, he got it for chemistry, for discovering the molecule of insulin. He was a huge advocate of overdosing on vitamin C. He was the biggest authority in chemistry of his time. No? He passed away, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And during his life, nobody in the profession could publish an article contesting that, either from clinical trials or just from science. People would either not be published, some had their careers ruined over that, and he was wrong. So, you know, sometimes we trust institutions, we trust facts, but the problem is that also science is an institutional process. It combines various particular interests that exist in institutions, academic and commercial, and we can't just delegate that trust. I think that the problem of complexity in present societies is that we have to integrate fact-finding, fact-establishing with some process of public learning, of political culture. There are examples. Consider AIDS support groups who have fought tooth and nail to get experimental medicines out, not only within testing, but to a broader population in order to prevent deaths. There are various other topics, particularly about health, where things are contestable, where interests are very clear. I think sometimes when I observe anti-vaxxer discourse, it's frequently mothers who have kids with severe conditions, and it's only reasonable that they would ask for rationalization why the thing that has happened to their child is not their responsibility, because there are so many factors putting pressure on parents that their child should be perfect these days. So I think these two things work one into another, and we have to understand those things. No? As Emily has suggested, there is something to be gained by approaching the whole problem of factuality a little bit different, thinking it as a political problem. No?
I'm going to stop you here because there might be one last question in the audience, because then it's time for all of us to move over to the exhibition. There we are.
Thank you very much. My name is Tim de Winkel. I'm a PhD under José van Dijk at the Utrecht Data School, and I study the public sphere by studying its margins, so also the alt-right. And my question is on your good faith in the participation of an alt-right in this public sphere or in this knowledge production. So basically, yes, of course, epistemology is institutionalized, and there's a lot of examples where you can say we should have public participation and political participation. But what is left of an alt-right epistemology or an alt-right truth sphere, let's say, when we come to Florian's alt-right intellectuals, and they are in good faith, and we have a shared epistemology. What is left then, or is it all just ignorance and propaganda and racism? Because it seems you take them really serious as serious actors in a debate on shared terms, on shared epistemology. Can we do that?
Yeah. Is it a question for me, or?
Yeah, for all of you.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. I think the question of whether you take something serious is not on the person but on the argument. Yeah? And then you have to look at the argument. So let's say I would not dismiss a valid argument, or at least an interesting argument, when it's coming from the alt-right. I'm missing that currently. Yeah? But I also think, I mean, what let's say the current production of, however you want to call it, propaganda or discourse from the alt-right does, it actually forces the whole field, including, for example, all the humanities department and art school departments here, to kind of sharpen, clarify the language. For example, you cannot speak so easily of alternative culture anymore, as you did 10 years ago. Yeah? Or, I mean, I brought up the example of, you know, post-colonialism and ethnopluralism. That's another example. Or another example would be, I mean, the alt-right has smartened up in comparison to older generations of racists and neo-fascists, that, for example, they would not say, no, we are Holocaust deniers, the Holocaust didn't exist, but there are theories, or there is proof, or there is some evidence that suggests that maybe it didn't exist. And all we want from you is to give it equal hearing, to equal representation. You know? The Wikipedia article on the Holocaust should say, well, there's 50% likelihood that it happened and 50% that it didn't happen. That's all we want. Yeah? That's, by the way, the same argument used by the creationists in America. Yeah? Creationism should be on the same...
Come to your point.
Yeah, yeah. But that's the problem. Huh? I mean, that kind of framing is the problem, and that is what you need to attack. So in that sense, I think you have to take them seriously, and you have to counter the points, because otherwise you will lose this hegemonic battle that's currently going on. And you cannot just say it's nonsense from 4chan and leave it in 4chan.
Yeah, if you agree, you can just agree, because then... yes, no, but...
Yeah, as I mentioned the example earlier of media giving visibility to right-wing politicians before they have basically popular support, that happens frequently in a number of cases, including climate denialism. No, where you get equal hearing for somebody who is a denialist, who belongs to that 1 to 2% of scientists, if they are scientists to start with, just as somebody who represents 98% of scientists. But that's not; those are not equal aggregates. They are very different, and so I think that is really a question of responsibility in the media as well. Like, whom do you give hearing, and how do you frame it? Yeah.
Maybe just a 10-second point, if I'm allowed. I would also like to voice what Florian said a couple of minutes ago, which is that a lot of left-wing political history of political thought has been very interlaced with right-wing or far-right-wing intellectual political history of political thoughts. And I think it's very difficult to dismiss them completely as such, because if we are to consider their arguments and their ideas, then we would also have to, well, take a sort of self-reflective stand or a perspective about our own intellectual history. If that makes sense. I mean, it's difficult to dismiss them entirely because they are part of the political language also that we are using, and solving the particular issues that you know, the morally dubious concepts that they bring forth implies that we revisit that kind of intellectual history that we're all part of. Yeah.
Which are very beautiful last words for this panel discussion, which I think will be taking home or to the exposition as a starting point for further trying to unravel the complexities that are present in front of us, and trying to also see where myself, I can try to reach a moral standard where I try to believe at least the things that I believe in that are not alternative. And I suppose that a lot of the artists that Renata and Irena have invited to participate in the exposition have done so exactly. So I think After a firm round of applause for Emillie, Tomislav and Florian. We take up the invitation to go over to the exposition and all think a little bit harder and deeper, and we might do so later on. You will be present for a little bit longer. Florian needs to excuse himself, he has an appointment. So if there's questions that you didn't dare ask in public or theories that you want to sell to these two people, time is all on your side. Thank you.